The use of more than one of these remedies became worldwide. The Greeks borrowed them from the Egyptians. We have piously accepted them from the Greeks, and our contemporaries still swallow with resignation many of the abominable mixtures invented on the banks of the Nile, long before the building of the pyramids. End of section 24. Chapter 3. The Legendary History of Egypt, Part 9. It was Thought who had taught men arithmetic. Thought had revealed to them the mysteries of geometry and mensuration. Thought had constructed instruments and promulgated the laws of music. Thought had instituted the art of drawing, and had codified its unchanging rules. He had been the inventor or patron of all that was useful or beautiful in the Nile Valley, and the climax of his beneficence was reached by his invention of the principles of writing, without which humanity would have been liable to forget his teaching, and to lose the advantages of his discoveries. It has been sometimes questioned whether writing, instead of having been a benefit to the Egyptians, did not rather injure them. An old legend relates that when the god unfolded his discovery to King Thamos, whose minister he was, the monarch immediately raised an objection to it. Children and young people, who had hitherto been forced to apply themselves diligently to learn and retain whatever was taught them, now that they possessed a means of storing up knowledge without trouble, would cease to apply themselves, and would neglect to exercise their memories. Whether Thamos was right or not, the criticism came too late. The ingenious art of painting words and of speaking to the eyes had once for all been acquired by the Egyptians, and through them by the greater part of mankind. It was a very complex system, in which were united most of the methods fitted for giving expression to thought, namely, those which were limited to the presentment of the idea, and those which were intended to suggest sounds. At the outset the use was confined to signs intended to awaken the idea of the object in the mind of the reader, by the more or less faithful picture of the object itself. For example, they depicted the sun by a centered disk, the moon by a crescent, a lion by a lion in the act of walking, a man by a small figure in a squatting attitude. As by this method it was possible to convey only a very restricted number of entirely materialistic concepts, it became necessary to have recourse to various artifices in order to make up for the shortcomings of the ideograms properly so called. The part was put for the whole, the pupil in place of the whole eye, the head of the ox instead of the complete ox. The Egyptians substituted cause for effect and effect for cause, the instrument for the work accomplished, and the disk of the sun signified the day, a smoking brazier the fire, the brush, inkpot, and palette of the scribe denoting writing or written documents. They conceived the idea of employing some object which presented an actual or supposed resemblance to the notion to be conveyed. Thus, the 4 parts of a lion denoted priority, supremacy, command, the wasp symbolized royalty, and a tadpole stood for hundreds of thousands. They ventured finally to use conventionalisms, as for instance when they drew the axe for a god, or the ostrich feather for justice. The sign in these cases had only a conventional connection with the concept assigned to it. At times 2 or 3 of these symbols were associated in order to express conjointly an idea which would have been inadequately rendered by one of them alone. A 5-pointed star placed under an inverted crescent moon denoted a month. A calf running before the sign for water indicated thirst. All these artifices combined furnished, however, but a very incomplete means of seizing and transmitting thought. When the writer had written out 20 or 30 of these signs and the ideas which they were supposed to embody, he had before him only the skeleton of a sentence, from which the flesh and sinews had disappeared. The tone and rhythm of the words were wanting, as were also the indications of gender, number, person, and inflection, which distinguish the different parts of speech and determine the varying relations between them. Besides this, in order to understand for himself, and to guess the meaning of the author, the reader was obliged to translate the symbols which he deciphered, by means of words which represented in the spoken language the pronunciation of each symbol. Whenever he looked at them, they suggested to him both the idea and the word for the idea, and consequently a sound or group of sounds. When each of them had thus acquired 3 or 4 invariable associations of sound, he forgot their purely ideographic value, and accustomed himself to consider them merely notations of sound. The first experiment in phonetics was a species of rebus, where each of the signs, divorced from its original sense, served to represent several words, similar in sound, but differing in meaning in the spoken language. The same group of articulations, nafir, no-fear, conveyed in Egyptian the concrete idea of a lute, and the abstract idea of beauty. The sign expressed at once the lute and beauty. The beetle was called kopiru, and the verb to be was pronounced kopiru. The figure of the beetle consequently signified both the insect and the verb, and by further combining with it other signs, the articulation of each corresponding syllable was given in detail. The sieve, mayu, the mat, pu, pi, the mouth, ra, ru, gave the formula kau piru, which was equivalent to the sound of kopiru, the verb to be. Grouped together, they denoted in writing the concept of to be by means of a treble rebus. In this system, each syllable of a word could be represented by one of several signs, all sounding alike. One half of these syllables stood for open, the other half for closed syllables, and the use of the former soon brought about the formation of a true alphabet. The final vowel in them became detached, and left only the remaining consonant, for example, R in ru, H in ha, N in ni, B in bu, so that ru, ha, bu eventually stood for R, H, N, and B only. This process, in the course of time, having been applied to a certain number of syllables, furnished a fairly large alphabet, in which several letters represented each of the 22 chief articulations, which the scribes considered sufficient for their purposes. The signs corresponding to one and the same letter were homophones, or equivalents in sound. One would have thought that when the Egyptians had arrived thus far, they would have been led, as a matter of course, to reject the various characters which they had each used in its turn, in order to retain an alphabet only. But the true spirit of invention, of which they had given proof, abandoned them here as elsewhere. If the merit of a discovery was often their due, they were rarely able to bring their invention to perfection. They kept the ideographic and syllabic signs which they had used at the outset, and, with the residue of their successive notations, made for themselves a most complicated system, in which syllables and ideograms were mingled with letters properly so called. There is a little of everything in an Egyptian phrase, sometimes even in a word, as, for instance, in maziru, the ear, or keru, the voice. There are the syllable ker, the ordinary letters which complete the phonetic pronunciation, and finally the ideogram, which gives the picture of the ear by the side of the written word for it, and another which proves that the letters represent a term designating an action of the mouth. This medley had its advantages. It enabled the Egyptians to make clear, by the picture of the object, the sense of words which letters alone might sometimes insufficiently explain. The system demanded a serious effort of memory and long years of study. Indeed, many people never completely mastered it. The picturesque appearance of the sentences, in which we see representations of men, animals, furniture, weapons, and tools grouped together in successive little pictures, rendered hieroglyphic writing specially suitable for the decoration of the temples of the gods or the palaces of kings. Mingled with scenes of worship, sacrifice, battle, or private life, the inscriptions frame or separate groups of personages, and occupy the vacant spaces which the sculptor or painter was at a loss to fill. Hieroglyphic writing is preeminently a monumental script. For the ordinary purposes of life it was traced in black or red ink on fragments of limestone or pottery, or on wooden tablets covered with stucco, and especially on the fibers of papyrus. The exigencies of haste and the unskilfulness of scribes soon changed both its appearance and its elements. The characters, when contracted, superimposed and united to one another with connecting strokes, preserved only the most distant resemblance to the persons or things which they had originally represented. This cursive writing, which was somewhat incorrectly termed hieratic, was used only for public or private documents, for administrative correspondence, or for the propagation of literary, scientific, and religious works. It was thus that tradition was pleased to ascribe to the gods, and among them to thought, the doubly great, the invention of all the arts and sciences which gave to Egypt its glory and prosperity. It was clear, not only to the vulgar, but to the wisest of the nation, that had their ancestors been left merely to their own resources, they would never have succeeded in raising themselves much above the level of the brutes. The idea that a discovery of importance to the country could have risen in a human brain, and once made known, could have been spread and developed by the efforts of successive generations, appeared to them impossible to accept. They believed that every art, every trade, had remained unaltered from the outset, and if some novelty in its aspect tended to show them their error, they preferred to imagine a divine intervention, rather than be undeceived. The mystic writing, inserted as chapter 64 in the Book of the Dead, and which subsequently was supposed to be of decisive moment to the future life of man, was, as they knew, posterior in date to the other formulas of which this book was composed. They did not, however, regard it any the less as being of divine origin. It had been found one day, without any one knowing whence it came, traced in blue characters on a plaque of alabaster, at the foot of the statue of Thought, in the sanctuary of Hermopolis. A prince, Hardiduf, had discovered it in his travels, and regarding it as a miraculous object, had brought it to his sovereign. This king, according to some, was Hasaphaiti of the first dynasty, but by others was believed to be the pious Mykerinos. In the same way, the book on medicine, dealing with the diseases of women, was held not to be the work of a practitioner. It had revealed itself to a priest watching at night before the Holy of Holies in the temple of Isis at Coptos. Although the earth was plunged into darkness, the moon shone upon it and enveloped it with light. It was sent as a great wonder to the holiness of King Cheops, the just of speech. The gods had thus exercised a direct influence upon men until they became entirely civilized, and this work of culture was apportioned among the three divine dynasties according to the strength of each. The first, which comprised the most vigorous divinities, had accomplished the more difficult task of establishing the world on a solid basis. The second had carried on the education of the Egyptians, and the third had regulated, in all its minutiae, the religious constitution of the country. When there was nothing more demanding supernatural strength or intelligence to establish it, the gods returned to heaven, and were succeeded on the throne by mortal men. One tradition maintained dogmatically that the first human king whose memory it preserved followed immediately after the last of the gods, who in quitting the palace had made over the crown to man as his heir, and that the chains of nature had not entailed any interruption in the line of sovereigns. Another tradition would not allow that the contact between the human and divine series had been so close. Between the Ennead and Menes, it intercalculated one or more lines of Theban or Thinite kings, but these were of so formless, shadowy, and undefined an aspect that they were called manes, and there was attributed to them at most only a passive existence, as of persons who had always been in the condition of the dead, and had never been subjected to the trouble of passing through life. Menes was the first in order of those who were actually living. From his time, the Egyptians claimed to possess an uninterrupted list of the pharaohs who had ruled over the Nile Valley. As far back as the 18th dynasty, this list was written upon papyrus, and furnished the number of years that each prince occupied the throne, or the length of his life. End of section 25. Chapter 3. The Legendary History of Egypt, Part 10. Extracts from it were inscribed in the temples, or even in the tombs of private persons, and 3 of these abridged catalogues are still extant, 2 coming from the temples of Seti I and Ramses II at Abydos, while the other was discovered in the tomb of a person of rank named Tunari at Saqqara. They divided this interminable succession of often problematical personages into dynasties, following in this division rules of which we are ignorant, and which varied in the course of ages. In the time of the Ramessides, names in the list which subsequently under Logodes formed 5 groups were made to constitute one single dynasty. Manetho of Sebennytus, who wrote a history of Europe for the use of Alexandrine Greeks, had adopted, on some unknown authority, a division of 31 dynasties from Menes to the Macedonian conquest, and his system has prevailed, not indeed on account of its excellence, but because it is the only complete one which has come down to us. All the families inscribed in his list ruled in succession. The country was no doubt frequently broken up into a dozen or more independent states, each possessing its own kings during several generations, but the annalists had from the outset discarded these collateral lines, and recognized only one legitimate dynasty, of which the rest were but vassals. Their theory of legitimacy does not always agree with actual history, and the particular line of princes which they rejected as usurpers represented at times the only family possessing true rights to the crown. In Egypt as elsewhere, the official chroniclers were often obliged to accommodate the past to the exigencies of the present, and to manipulate the annals to suit the reigning party. While obeying their orders, the chroniclers deceived posterity, and it is only by a rare chance that we can succeed in detecting them in the act of falsification, and can re-establish the truth. The system of Manetho, in the state in which it has been handed down to us by epitomizers, has rendered, and continues to render, service to science. If it is not the actual history of Egypt, it is a sufficiently faithful substitute to warrant our not neglecting it, when we wish to understand and reconstruct the sequence of events. His dynasties furnish the necessary framework for most of the events and revolutions, of which the monuments have preserved us a record. At the outset, the centre to which the affairs of the country gravitated was in the extreme north of the valley. The principality which extended from the entrance of the Fayum to the apex of the delta, and subsequently to the town of Memphis itself, imposed their sovereigns upon the remaining nomes, served as an emporium for commerce and national industries, and received homage and tribute from neighbouring peoples. About the time of the 6th dynasty this centre of gravity was displaced, and tended towards the interior. It was arrested for a short time at Heracleopolis, 9th and 10th dynasties, and ended by fixing itself at Thebes, 11th dynasty. From henceforth Thebes became the capital, and furnished Egypt with her rulers. With the exception of the 14th Zayat dynasty, all the families occupying the throne from the 11th to the 20th dynasty were Theban. When the barbarian shepherds invaded Africa from Asia, the Thebaid became the last refuge and bulwark of Egyptian nationality. Its chiefs struggled for many centuries against the conquerors before they were able to deliver the rest of the valley. It was a Theban dynasty, the 18th, which inaugurated the era of foreign conquest, but after the 19th, a movement, the reverse of that which had taken place towards the end of the first period, brought back the centre of gravity, little by little, towards the north of the country. From the time of the 21st dynasty, Thebes ceased to hold the position of capital. Tanis, Bubastis, Mendes, Sabinitos, and above all Sais disputed the supremacy with each other, and political life was concentrated in the maritime provinces. Those of the interior, ruined by Ethiopian and Assyrian invasions, lost their influence and gradually dwindled away. Thebes became impoverished and depopulated. It fell into ruins, and soon was nothing more than a resort for devotees or travellers. The history of Egypt is, therefore, divided into 3 periods, each corresponding to the suzerainty of a town or principality. 1. The Memphite period, usually called the Ancient Empire, from the 1st to the 10th dynasty. Kings of Memphite origin ruled over the whole of Egypt during the greater part of this epoch. 2. Theban period, from the 11th to the 20th dynasty. It is divided into 2 parts by the invasion of the shepherds, 16th dynasty. 2a. The First Theban Empire, Middle Empire, from the 11th to the 14th dynasty. 2b. The New Theban Empire, from the 17th to the 20th dynasty. 3. Saite period, from the 21st to the 30th dynasty, divided into 2 unequal parts by the Persian conquest. 3a. The First Saite period, from the 21st to the 26th dynasty. The Second Saite period, from the 28th to the 30th dynasty. The Memphites had created the monarchy. The Thebans extended the rule of Egypt far and wide, and made of her a conquering state. For nearly 6 centuries she ruled over the Upper Nile and over Western Asia. Under the Saites she retired gradually within her natural frontiers, and from having been aggressive became assailed, and suffered herself to be crushed in turn by all the nations she had once oppressed. The monuments have as yet yielded no account of the events which tended to unite the country under the rule of one man. We can only surmise that the feudal principalities had gradually been drawn together into 2 groups, each of which formed a separate kingdom. Heliopolis became the chief focus in the north, from which civilization radiated over the rich plains and the marshes of the delta. Its colleges of priests had collected, condensed, and arranged the principal myths of the local religions. The Aeneid to which it gave conception would never have obtained the popularity which we must acknowledge it had, if its princes had not exercised, for at least some period, an actual suzerainty over the neighbouring plains. It was around Heliopolis that the kingdom of Lower Egypt was organized. Everything there bore traces of Heliopolitan theories: the protocol of the kings, their supposed descent from Ra, the enthusiastic worship which they offered to the sun. The Delta, owing to its compact and restricted area, was aptly suited for government from one centre. The Nile Valley proper, narrow, tortuous, and stretching like a thin strip on either bank of the river, did not lend itself to so complete a unity. It too represented a single kingdom, having the reed and the lotus for its emblems, but its component parts were more loosely united, its religion was less systematized, and it lacked a well-placed city to serve as a political and sacerdotal centre. Hermopolis contained schools of theologians who certainly played an important part in the development of myths and dogmas, but the influence of its rulers was never widely felt. In the south, Siut disputed their supremacy, and Heracleopolis stopped their road to the north. These three cities thwarted and neutralized one another, and not one of them ever succeeded in obtaining a lasting authority over Upper Egypt. Each of the two kingdoms had its own natural advantages and its system of government, which gave to it a particular character, and stamped it, as it were, with a distinct personality down to its latest days. The kingdom of Upper Egypt was more powerful, richer, better populated, and was governed apparently by more active and enterprising rulers. It is to one of the latter, Mene or Menes of Thinis, that tradition ascribes the honour of having fused the two Egypts into a single empire, and having inaugurated the reign of the human dynasties. Thinis figured in the historic period as one of the least of Egyptian cities. It barely maintained an existence on the left bank of the Nile, if not on the exact spot now occupied by Gerga, at least only a short distance from it. The principality of the Osirian reliquary, of which it was the metropolis, occupied the valley from one mountain range to the other, and gradually extended across the desert as far as the great Theban oasis. Its inhabitants worshipped a sky god, Anhuri, or rather two twin gods, Anhuri-Shu, who were speedily amalgamated with the solar deities and became a warlike personification of Ra. Anhuri-Shu, like all the other solar manifestations, came to be associated with a goddess having the form or head of a lioness, a Sokhit, who took for the occasion the epithet of Mihit, the northern one. Some of the dead from this city are buried on the other side of the Nile, near the modern village of Meshek, at the foot of the Arabian chain, whose steep cliffs here approach somewhat near the river. The principal necropolis was at some distance to the east, near the sacred town of Abydos. It would appear that, at the outset, Abydos was the capital of the country, for the entire nome bore the same name as the city, and had adopted for its symbol the representation of the reliquary in which the god reposed. In very early times Abydos fell into decay, and resigned its political rank to Thinis, but its religious importance remained unimpaired. The city occupied a long and narrow strip of land between the canal and the first slopes of the Libyan mountains. A brick fortress defended it from the incursions of the Bedouin, and beside it the temple of the god of the dead reared its naked walls. Here Anhuri, having passed from life to death, was worshipped under the name of Khontamentete, the chief of that western region whither souls repair on quitting this earth. It is impossible to say by what blending of doctrines or by what political combinations this son of the night came to be identified with Osiris of Mendes, since the fusion dates back to a very remote antiquity. It had become an established fact long before the most ancient sacred books were compiled. Osiris Khontamentete grew rapidly in popular favour, and his temple attracted annually an increasing number of pilgrims. The great oasis had been considered at first as a sort of mysterious paradise, whither the dead went in search of peace and happiness. It was called Uifk, the sepulchre. This name clung to it after it had become an actual Egyptian province, and the remembrance of its ancient purpose survived in the minds of the people, so that the cleft, or gorge in the mountain through which the doubles journeyed towards it, never ceased to be regarded as one of the gates of the other world. At the time of the New Year festivals, spirits flocked thither from all parts of the valley. They there awaited the coming of the dying sun, in order to embark with him and enter safely the dominions of Khontamentete. Abydos, even before the historic period, was the only town, and its god the only god, whose worship, practised by all Egyptians, inspired them all with an equal devotion. The excavations of the last few years have brought to light some, at all events, of the oldest pharaohs known to the Egyptian annalists, namely, those whom they placed in their first human dynasties, and the locality where the monuments of these princes were discovered shows us that these writers were correct in representing Thinis as playing an important part in the history of the early ages of their country. In the tomb of Menes, that sovereign whom we are inclined to look upon as the first king of the official lists, lies near the village of Nagada, not far from Thebes. Those of his immediate successors are close to Thinis, in the cemeteries of Abydos. They stand at the very foot of the Libyan hills, near the entrance to the ravine, the cleft through which the mysterious oasis was reached, and thither the souls flocked in order that they might enter by a safe way the land beyond the grave. The mass of pottery, whole and broken, which has accumulated on this site from the offerings of centuries, has obtained for it among the Fellahin the name of el-Gaab, the mother of pots. The tombs lie there in serried ranks. They present for the most part a rough model of the pyramids of the Memphite period, rectangular structures of bricks without mortar rising slightly above the level of the plain. The funeral chamber occupies the centre of each, and is partly hollowed out of the soil, like a shallow well, the sides being bricked. It had a flat timber roof, covered by a layer of about 3 feet of sand. The floor was also of wood, and in several cases the remains of the beams of both ceiling and pavement have been brought to light. The body of the royal inmate was laid in the middle of the chamber, surrounded by its funeral furniture and by a part of the offerings. The remainder was placed in the little rooms which opened out of the principal vault, sometimes on the same level, sometimes on one higher than itself. After their contents had been laid within them, the entrance to these rooms was generally walled up. Human bodies have been found inside them, probably those of slaves killed at the funeral, that they might wait upon the dead in his life beyond the grave. The objects placed in these chambers were mostly offerings, but besides these there were coarse stelae bearing the name of a person, and dedicated to the double of his luminary. Some of them mention a dwarf, or a favourite dog of the sovereign, who accompanied his master into the tomb. Tablets of ivory or bone skilfully incised furnish us with scenes representing some of the ceremonies of the deification of the king in his lifetime, and the sacrifices offered at the time of his burial. In rarer instances they record his exploits. End of section 26. Chapter 3. The Legendary History of Egypt, Part 11. The offerings themselves were such as we meet with in burials of a subsequent age: bread, cakes, meat, and poultry of various sorts. Indeed, everything we find mentioned in the lists inscribed in the tombs of the later dynasties, particularly the jars of wine and liquors, on the clay bungs of which are still legible the impression of the signet bearing the name of the sovereign for whose use they were sealed. Besides stuffs and mats, the furniture comprised chairs, beds, stools, an enormous number of vases, some in coarse pottery for common use, others in choice stone, such as diorite, granite, or rock crystal very finely worked, on the fragments of all of which may be read, cut in outline, the names and preamble of the pharaoh to whom the object belonged. The ceremonial of the funerary offering and its significance was already fully developed at this early period. This can be gathered by the very nature of the objects buried with the deceased, by their number, quantity, and by the manner in which they were arranged. Like their successors in the Egypt of later times, these ancient kings expected to continue their material existence within the tomb, and they took precautions that life there should be as comfortable as circumstances should permit.